Welcome to the AgEmerge podcast, brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. Your farming challenges are unique, so your practices should be too. We're here to share emerging ideas, build connections, and provoke conversation.
Get ready to improve your soil, your crops, your livestock, and your family's livelihood. I'm your producer, Kim Chase.
And I'm your host, Monte Bottens. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. Today, we welcome Dr. Kelsey Griesheim, Assistant Professor of Soil Fertility at North Dakota State University. She completed her PhD at the University of Illinois, where she worked under Dr. Richard Mulvaney, conducting field evaluations and measuring fertilizer uptake efficiency of various application types. Monte and Dr. Griesheim take a deep dive into her studies of nitrogen. She gives us a lot to think about, like when we apply nitrogen, we're fertilizing our crops, but we're also fertilizing the microorganisms. And that, Dr. Griesheim points out, is why nitrogen management is so difficult, because we have to take into account the fact that the nitrogen is not just being used by the plants, it's also being used by the microorganisms in the soil. And it turns out they're often a lot better at scavenging nitrogen than the crop is. We'll cover that and so much more, so let's get started.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Today we are joined with Dr. Kelsey Griesheim with North Dakota State University, and she's coming to us live from Fargo, North Dakota. Welcome, Kelsey.
Hi, good morning.
We're, you and Dr. Richard Mulvaney at the University of Illinois did some really interesting work that piqued my interest, and that's why we're visiting today. But before we dive into all things radioactive and nitrogen based, tell us a little bit of your story, Kelsey, how you got started in academia and what drives your interest today.
Yeah, I grew up in Mount Pulaski, Illinois, which was a small town close to Springfield, and started off detasseling, as all good crop scientists start, right? I did that for, I think, 3 summers, and basically went on to look at crop sciences for a degree at the University of Illinois. I actually started in biotech. I was doing that for a couple of years, and then I took one soils course and I was like, nope, this is where I'm supposed to be. This is my place. These are my people. Quickly shifted. And that shift actually happened whenever I took Intro to Soils with Dr. Mulvaney. And so that was my first introduction to soils, was with him. I loved the course, loved it. And I basically went up to him after class and was like, hey, can I have a job in your lab? He said yes, and then the rest is history. So yeah.
Oh, that is awesome. So we took you from the cool field of biotech to be a dirt nerd like me.
Yes.
Awesome. That's great. So for those of you that haven't had the experience of detasseling corn, which I didn't have that job as a kid, but I was on a farm and I had several of my town friends that did detasseling. It was good money, right? But you all need to know about that experience, right? Wearing garbage bags and dew-soaked corn early in the morning, plucking male row tassels that the machine missed. How much is that? Just the ultimate fun, or is that something that once you've done that you can do anything?
Yeah, I feel like it's like, you have to earn your way, right? And detasseling is how you do it. But I feel like with that job, it's who you work with. We had a really fun group, and so it was fun. But
well, that's awesome. So I mean, that prepped you for not being afraid to do research in the field or related to soil then, because
yes.
a lot of the work that you do and have done is hard work, right? It's hard, it's dirty work, and it's hot, it's muddy, it's dusty, it's everything. So talk to us about some of the research projects you've been involved in before we dive deep into the nitrogen study. But share with us kind of your progression of once you came to Dr. Mulvaney's lab and were helping there, how that evolved.
Yeah, so just like with detasseling, when you start working in a lab, you kind of work on the grunt work, right? So when I first started, I was grinding soil samples, I was weighing things, doing all that kind of fun stuff before I kind of built a working relationship with Mulvaney, and he's like, okay, you're ready for research. And so that's when I jumped into doing research. I have kind of two different types of projects that I do. One of them is the one that you're interested in, the field study. The other half of it is more methodology work. So there's lots of different forms of nitrogen in the soil, and we're interested in all of those because we want to understand how nitrogen cycles in the soil. And we have to be able to measure those fractions of nitrogen. And so some of the work that I've done has revolved around measuring different things in the soil. Typically, I don't talk about that research because honestly, unless you like chemistry and are interested in talking about those pools, it's very boring to some people, and I can appreciate that. But I will just say that that type of work allows me to do the field research. It allows me to understand what's happening in the soil and talk about it in a meaningful way. So while it's not as exciting, it's certainly important, for sure.
Now, wait a minute. I love boring. Okay. I really do. Now, you mean to tell me that the nitrogen, and I applied to the field, that there's more than just that? I thought I had to buy everything I needed. Holy moly, you got to be kidding. There's more than one source of nitrogen in a field. This might be fun. Walk us through all those different pools, this complex interaction. And in fact, there's a lot of similarities to the complexity of carbon in the soil and why we're having such problems with measuring carbon in the soil, because those two go hand in hand. So talk to us about that diversity and that all the different pools, the cycling times, and what causes the change in the cycling times and such.
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a question that so part of my job at NDSU is teaching as well. So I teach Intro to Soils as part of my appointment. And I think I spend maybe a whole week on the question that you just asked me. So huge topic, but
just talk fast. That's all you got to do. Talk really fast.
Really fast? Okay. Time me, let's go. My students love when I do that too, when I talk fast. No. So the main part, or kind of the heart of the nitrogen cycle. Well, first I should back up. Mother Nature has been growing plants for a long time, right? We are not responsible for growing crops, right?
Hold it. On the 8th day, the fertilizer dealer wasn't spoken into existence.
No, it didn't.
Okay.
Not even after God rested. Yeah, no, it didn't happen. So yeah, Mother Nature is good at growing crops. There is a natural supply of nitrogen in the soil. It's there. And it gets there a couple different ways. One of them certainly is by fertilizer. But other than that, there's things like organic inputs. So we have native plants that are growing and dying, replenishing organic matter in the soil. We can have asymbiotic N2 fixation. These are microbes in the soil that are taking atmospheric nitrogen in the air and fixing it into their biomass. You can also have nitrogen come in through lightning, right? Lightning is a huge source of energy that can also be used to take that atmospheric nitrogen and fix it into the soil. So lots of different ways it can be input into the soil. And at the heart of it are what we call heterotrophic microorganisms in the soil that perform what we call mineralization, immobilization, turnover. So what that turnover is these organisms, just like the plants, need carbon and nitrogen. Now, unlike the plants, they're not getting their carbon from CO2, they're getting their carbon from the carbon that's in the soil. That's part of organic matter, okay? And they're taking that in to build enzymes and to use for energy. So whenever we apply nitrogen, we are fertilizing our crops, but we are also fertilizing the microorganisms. And that is really at the crux of why nitrogen management is so difficult, because we have to take into account the fact that nitrogen is not just being used by the plants, it's also being used by microorganisms in the soil. And they are a lot better at scavenging and taking up that nitrogen most of the time than the crop is. And that is why we don't always see, well, will say why we never see 100% uptake into the crop, unless you're growing on like a sand or in a greenhouse, right?
Hydroponic, yes.
Hydroponics, right?
So, yeah, that's interesting. So, a long time ago, a good microbiologist friend of mine, and he explained this to me, said that real simple concept: microbes eat first, and
Yes.
always have to keep that in mind because they're a lot better at it. They move, they're mobile, they're billions and billions count wise. So, yeah, it's a matter of making sure when we are applying fertilizer amendments that first off only apply what we need, right? We have a horrific appetite to over apply, and I call that being if a little bit's good, right? More is better. So if you're putting more on, that makes you a moron. So we don't really we don't want farmers to be morons. We want them to be judicious in what they do. But that comes into the whole what you're talking about with the different pools and the microbes is the timing of the application, the placement of the application, the form of the application all has effects on these different pools and how they relate with each other. So the asymbiotic, there's a lot of work going on there, right? For additives to the soil that have these free living, non-associating microbes that fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So there's quite a bit of that going on, and a lot of it's been commercialized. There's also some things going on with the lightning approach too, isn't there? You know, and trying to develop that. There's some companies out of Europe using electricity to try to pull atmospheric nitrogen to make that available. So all of these processes are getting more and more attention these days, aren't they? How do we what would you say now that you know what you know, what % of this do we understand, these associations? Is it one of these things that the more we know, the more we know that we don't know? Is that a fair way to say?
Yes, that's biology in a sentence, right? So complex. But I think there's definitely benefit in knowing what you don't know, so you know how to move forward. And I think you were mentioning these products that can be added, and yeah, there's lots of buzz around this right now. I think it's important to think about what is currently in the soil as well. Not just what can we add, but what is currently going on in our soils. And there's definitely some really awesome researchers that are working on those questions. We have one here at NDSU, his name is Barney Geddes, and he's working on those kinds of questions. And I think that deserves attention as well, right? Because if we just are adding things, you know, it's just interesting to think about interactions and understanding, you know, how much of it is coming from what we already have versus what we're adding, those kinds of things.
I agree. And it's important to optimize what we already have versus be a moron, right? So I get a kick out of one of the popular marketing approaches of one of the asymbiotic providers is, oh, well, we guarantee that it'll be just as good. You reduce 40 units of applied nitrogen and put our material out there and yields will be the same. It's our guarantee. Well, the reality is we're probably over fertilizing by 40 units anyway, you know, or we have a soil system that can do that for us. So yeah, it's good to look at those approaches. So what do you think are some of the promising approaches that you're seeing in this whole field of nitrogen fertility that farmers can be doing to reduce their inputs, whether it is synthetic nitrogen or other additives that, you know, cost money for a farmer to do?
Well, the quickest way to increase your efficiency is to reduce your denominator. And what I mean by that is if you think about what efficiency is, it is the amount that you're getting in the crop divided by the amount you're applying, right? That's efficiency. And so if you're reducing your denominator or the amount you're applying, you're going to increase efficiency. Now, am I saying that everyone across the board should decrease the amount of fertilizer you're using? No, right? This is going to be dependent on whether you are over fertilizing or not. If you're not over fertilizing, I would not recommend decreasing the amount of fertilizer you're applying. But if you are over fertilizing, first, you need to know that you're doing that. And then second, you can easily increase your efficiency by, again, reducing your denominator. This is something we saw that was kind of reflected in all of our papers that we did. There were 4 trials we looked at, and we saw that one of the biggest factors that was determining efficiency was fertility level. So we had a site, it was what we call the Birkbeck site, which is a alpha sol, which is a forest soil. It's typically poorer than something like a mollisol, like a drummer or an Ipaba. And we saw that at that site, the efficiency was highest, which makes sense. If we have a low amount of native native nitrogen and we apply fertilizer, that fertilizer is going to be used more because there's less of a dependence on it. More of a dependence on it.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So that's a good way to approach it. Nitrogen use efficiency is yield divided by pounds applied. So less pounds applied without sacrificing the yield makes our efficiency better. So we definitely want to go there. So let's dive into this study that caught my attention. This is so much fun. I apologize to everybody listening. I geek out on this stuff. So talk to us a little bit about what you did. The methods in there are pretty interesting. Talk to us about that study, and then also maybe some of the things that just surprised you. Well, we'll save that for a little bit, but talk about the methods of the study, how you did it, and like you said, the alpha-sol versus the mollisol in the protocol.
Yeah. So we had 4 different trials. Was there one in particular that you were interested in, or should I cover all of them?
Well, you can cover all of them. The one that I was reading about was the different placement types.
With the conceal.
But yeah, let's cover all of them because they're all important. And
yeah, they're all important, and they're all fairly similar in how they're set up and kind of the questions they're asking. So yeah, it's super easy to talk about all of them together. So before I talk about the specific trials, I want to talk about N15 because that is the tool that we used to ask all these questions, and some of us aren't aware of what N15 is, and I think it's a really cool tool. I'm a little biased, but I think it's cool. So typically when we measure efficiency in the field, we use something called the difference method. And with the difference method, we have 2 areas of the field. We're applying nitrogen here, not applying it here, looking at the difference in yield and calling that the uptake from the fertilizer. So pretty easy concept. There's a lot of issues with doing it that way. You're making a lot of assumptions. You're assuming that applying nitrogen does not change the microbial cycling of nitrogen, which, it does. It definitely does. So there's a couple issues there. It's cheap to do the difference method. Really, the only cost is the amount of, yield loss you have in your zero area. So it's done a lot, and it certainly has its place. However, there's a better approach, which is to use N15. So N15 is a heavy, stable isotope. It's safe, so it isn't actually radioactive. It's safe. It makes up about 0.3663% of what we're breathing right now in all the nitrogen. So what we can do is we can bump that level up, so increase the amount of the isotope, and then we can trace where certain fertilizer applications go. So when we apply the enriched fertilizer, we can trace how much of it gets into the crop, and we can also trace where it goes in the soil system as well. So it's really, really powerful. Basically, we can say exactly where that fertilizer application is going. The only kind of caveat to that is it gets difficult to trace it once it leaves the system because it gets diluted out. What I mean by that is it would be impossible or very difficult to trace that past when it's leached away from the system or if it's volatilized in the air. So typically with N15 studies, you can measure it in the plant, in the soil, And then if it's gone from the system, you simply say it's gone, right? Which from a producer standpoint, gone is gone, right? If it didn't get into the crop, if it's not in the soil, then it's not going to benefit them anymore. And it's also going to be a pollutant at that point as well, right? Because it's lost the system. So that's kind of the push behind my research program, is trying to find practices that increase efficiency, because it's a win-win situation. You have the most of a purchased resource getting into the crop, and that's good for the producer, right? You're getting the most out of what you're buying, but it's also good for the environment because we're leaving the least amount of it in the soil where it can be lost and become a pollutant.
The AgEmerge podcast is brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. The ASN team is hands-on, digging in and invested in regenerative agriculture. Along with the proper plant nutrition and biologicals to boost your soil microbiome, we provide the ideas and implementation guidance to support you on your soil health journey. So stop farming the same way and contact Ag Solutions Network today at asn.farm.
I think that's a real key point that you said there. It's not just gone. You didn't just lose it. It wasn't just a financial loss. Okay. I like to say there's 4 fates to nitrogen, right? That isn't utilized by the crop. And one is goes to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas, 283 times or so more potent than carbon dioxide. It runs off into our lakes and streams and creates dead zones, Lake Erie, the Chesapeake, the Gulf of Mexico, Raccoon River, all these problems, right? Third thing is it goes to our groundwater. We get to drink it, blue baby syndrome, calf abortions, all those kind of things. That's not good. Or the fourth thing I don't think a lot of people think about is it burns carbon out of our soil, because all these extra microbes get excited and that cycle increases and they burn carbon as their fuel source. So this precious carbon we're trying to build over time with excess nitrogen applications can be a problem. So I love that you say it's the P word, and we need to not be offended by that, farmers. We need to realize that it's not just gone. It's not just a financial loss. We're polluting something somewhere for someone else. So there comes a time when those people don't like that, and they're going to tell us not to do that. So we need to be ready for that. Sorry, I had to get on my soapbox there, Kelsey. But so talk to us a little bit about how, was it surprising? And I think this is one of the things that came out of the papers was how little of the applied nitrogen is actually used by the crop. This is like mind blowing, right?
Yeah, that's definitely an important finding from the studies, was simply the magnitude of the numbers. So in all the studies, we were kind of doing these treatment comparisons. We looked at fall applied anhydrous ammonia with and without nitropyrin or N-Serve. We looked at sidedress applications, the pre-plant applications. We also did a trial with looking at different forms. But from all those, the magnitude of the numbers is what was interesting. And the great thing about percentages is you can look at the reverse of it, right? So if we're only getting 30% of our nitrogen in the crop, then that means there's 70% that's being left in the soil. And I think those numbers are good to be aware of. You are not getting 100, 90, 80, 70% of your nitrogen into your crop. It's not happening. And that's important for producers to know.
And other follow-up research or concurrent research that you and or Dr. Mulvaney has done is clearly states applied nitrogen as fertilizer cannot be reliably stored for a subsequent crop year too. So is that correct? Am I remembering that right? I'm going back in the file cabinets here, but
so Mulvaney has had a very extensive career, so he may have worked on that topic. I'm pretty familiar with a lot of his work, but okay. I'm not all of it by any means. We definitely did not ask that question in our papers. I will say though, for the anhydrous paper, we did take soil samples and we are hoping to kind of look at that question. So we took soil samples at harvest And I spent a lot of time fractionating it into those different pools we talked about. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of speak about that and say, how much of it is left over. There have been some researchers that have looked at that type of question. Not a lot. N15, something I didn't mention, is very expensive. It's incredibly expensive. A number that I calculated a couple of years ago, I think for 200 pounds of N for 1 acre, it costs about $172,000 for 1 acre. So this research is limited because of that. But I will say that I have a couple of projects in the works that are also kind of getting at that question. Because another thing to keep in mind too is that retention would probably be affected by different management practices as well. And so very complex question, something that I'm hoping to get into. The research that we currently have published doesn't get at that right now.
What is your, what do you suspect? And I realize you haven't completed it yet or dove into it, but what do you suspect some of those different management practices are that allow nitrogen to, persist longer in the soil or be used by subsequent crops or such?
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, this is conjecture at this point. No research that I've done has looked at this. But you would think that if we have good microbial cycling, healthy soils that are able to cycle the nutrients, that would certainly help with retention, right? So immobilization, right? If we have immobilized nitrogen, that would be a way in which it would stay longer in the soil, one would think. So yeah, certainly a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. And I think that's important, especially as we are talking more and more about soil health, right? How are those topics impacting fertilizer retention? Is it positive? Is it negative? Those are important questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. So I had a few questions here, and I thought it was interesting. One of the out of the conclusions of the one study I referred to with the different placement positions of early nitrogen. It says ranging from 5% to 34% in the grain and 7 to 46% of the applied nitrogen in the total above ground biomass. Just was wondering, why is there more of that nitrogen in the biomass versus the grain? Is that showing that application was used by the biomass, but later bioavailable nitrogen supplied grain fill?
Yeah, so something that's interesting about those pre-plant applications, first of all, with a lot of the other projects that we did, we were looking at labeling all of the nitrogen. Whereas with that project, we labeled the first 80 pounds that went on, and we did not label the 120 pounds. And the reason for that is because we weren't really interested in what was happening with that side dress application. We were interested in what was happening with that 80-pound starter application or pre-plant application. And so that's something to keep in mind, that we're talking, again, if you decrease the denominator, right? If it's 80 pounds, you're going to get presumably higher efficiency. So the reason why we believed we saw that was simply because we were looking at that pre-plant application. And so that fertilizer was taken up earlier in the growing season, and so it was more likely to stay in the biomass than to be remobilized into the grain. Now, we can't see that for certain because we did not take periodic sampling of the crops. We just looked at harvest, but that's the reason why we thought that happened.
The other thing would be interesting to find out too is if the plant could have been sampled from below ear and above ear to see what the isotope difference would be, to know if that 20% that was in the grain, was it remobilized from tissue, or was it came from soil later, but any ideas on that, or where that is, that still being delivered from the soil, or do you think that was remobilized? Or no way?
It certainly could have been remobilized. Again, that's not something we really looked at for the study. Sure. That kind of work is definitely done. Typically that work is done in the greenhouse just because it's easier to manage and with those kinds of questions.
And
but yeah, for the Sorry, what'd you say?
I'm sorry, the $172,000 an acre has a reason to do it in the labs too.
Yeah, it's, it's every researcher has that, right? Where they want to add more treatments and more measurements, and at some point you have to cut it. And yeah, there was a couple of things. I think something else I really wish we could have included is we did the trial looking at ammoniacal versus nitrate sources. I would have loved to include urease in that project, and it just, we couldn't add another treatment. So.
Well, the good part is you're young, you're an associate professor now, so you've got lots of opportunities to do this, right?
Yes. Yeah. No shortage of ideas, that's for sure. There's plenty to work on.
Just a shortage of funding there.
Yeah. Hey, you gotta have money to do research, right? Yeah.
So I thought, what did you find interesting in those different placement methods? Because here at our company, we recommend nitrogen, and the first nitrogen into the field we recommend with the planter. And we've gone through several iterations mechanically to make that happen. So, back in the old days, it was we had single double disc openers on the front of the planter. Then they did the totally tubular, dropping it off the rear, which you simulated. Then it went to conceal, and there's other options out there from other companies that, Yetter and 360, they put it into the soil index to the seed row. So we're all about this, and this is why it got my attention. Did you find the differences between those to be kind of interesting versus, basically a spray the field? Walk us through those differences that you saw there.
Yeah, so for the project, we were looking at placement at planting, and we think about what increases efficiency, right? Putting the nitrogen down when the crop needs it, right? And that is certainly a time when it needs it. So it makes sense that this type of application would increase efficiency. So for the paper, we had 4 different kind of treatments we were looking at. And again, we were just looking at the efficiency of that first application. We had conceal with 1 band versus 2 bands. And then we wanted to have a kind of comparison, a common comparison. And so we used a drag chain treatment, which was basically a dribble followed by a simulated drag chain. And then we also had a broadcast treatment. And something that was incredibly clear from the study and clear from others' research as well, this is not new information, is that banding the application is more efficient than broadcasting it. You're putting it where the crop needs it. You're providing a higher concentration of nitrogen, so less of it is being immobilized. So there's more available for the crop. That was like the big finding from the paper, very, very clear. And then the other finding was that there wasn't really a difference between the single and dual band. I do have to make a little bit of a caveat that we were just looking at nitrogen efficiency. Typically these applications aren't just nitrogen, right? So that's an important consideration. Was phosphorus efficiency better versus 1 versus 2? That's not something that we asked or answered with the paper. So we were just looking at nitrogen efficiency.
And your broadcast would be similar to a common practice in the Midwest of a weed and feed, where they put the nitrogen with the herbicide. That's kind of what you were comparing to. I realize you probably didn't have the herbicide with it, but that was the thinking behind that application.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that a big difference there that you said, and is that what's happening to that nitrogen that we're putting out in that broadcast scenario then? Do we know? Is it just not used by the plant and it's tied up in the biomass, or is it greatly increased subject to loss?
So we can certainly say from the results, because we did measure at harvest, that broadcast application wasn't ever subsequently taken up by the crop in that growing season. So it wasn't a situation where it was immobilized and then maybe taken up later in the growing season. Because we would have still seen the uptake at harvest. That being said, we didn't take soil samples at harvest for this project, and so we don't know if that N15 persisted past the growing season, but we can say that it did not remobilize, and then it wasn't taken back up later in the growing season, if that makes sense.
Of course, I had it up in front of me before, but now I don't. Do you remember the 80 units of broadcast versus 80 units of banded? What the difference was there in the total uptake? Wasn't it almost half as much on the broadcast was found its way into the plant?
I'm not sure what those numbers are.
As we're both looking at our phones right now.
Yeah. Okay, it was, let's see, total above ground biomass range from 11 to 46% when UAM was banded, and then from 7 to 34% when it was broadcast.
Okay. So it was anywhere from about 2/3 as efficient.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
Roughly. 3/4,
Yep.
2/3. But that's a wide range of variability you had.
It is, and it has to do back to what we were saying at the beginning about site variability. So comparing, a banded application on a poor soil versus a banded application on a rich soil, it's going to look different. It's going to look very different.
Yeah, and then so you're definitely getting it out of the poorer situations. You definitely see that response because you're you're more feeding the soil, you're more feeding the plant. Simple terms. Tell me about the tillage regime in these different sites. Was it similar, or was there some variation in the tillage?
So tillage was held constant across the sites. So that was not different between the sites. And it also, I don't believe it was different between the years either. That was consistent between the years. So tillage wasn't something we looked at. I will tell you now, it's something that I am currently trying to work on up here because it's so important when we're talking about nitrogen efficiency. And it's a big topic. And yeah, how we manage nitrogen applications with the different tillage regimes is really important. I have a colleague up here in NDSU who's done a lot of work on the topic. And he also has showed me the importance of length of duration with tillage. 2 years of a tillage regime versus 10 years of a tillage regime is totally different. And those are things that I'm hoping to get into. It's difficult to find sites that have long-term tillage regimes in place, but they're certainly around.
That is interesting. So you get a lot of release on that first till event versus continuous till. You get more of a probably a stabilizer, plateaued, predictable microbial release out of it, because we're changing microbial communities through tillage.
And carbon pools as well, which yep.
Cool. Because up in North Dakota, the outside of where you're at in the Red River Valley, no till is a way of life. So they don't even know what that word is around Champaign. I mean, so I would suspect, and would you suspect the same, that the results of your study would have been even more drastic between the broadcast and the banded in a long-term no-till situation, and especially if it was continuous corn? And maybe you might speak to that. Did you see a difference between corn on corn versus corn on after beans on the utilization efficiency? Did you get more tie up in the biomass associated with second year corn?
On the second year corn, yeah. I'm not recalling the rotation differences.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to look back at that, but that certainly would make sense, right? If you would have more carbon in the system. And I think, if that were the case, it would also be interesting to look at tillage as well. Right.
Because we really see an advantage in yield wise when you put nitrogen on the planter in no-till. So it's really a requirement. So it's great to see that understanding, these are agronomic practices we've known for a while. It's great to see the science documenting why that's happening. So
yeah, definitely.
I really, really appreciate that. So the simulated drag chain that caught my attention. How did you do this? And because one of the reasons I went away from the totally tubulars with the drag chain off the rear to conceal is when you ride the planter and you see those things just bouncing and flopping around, and it's kind of like blah 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 blah. Sorry for the sound effects here. Squirting nitrogen everywhere, and and then the drag chain kind of spreading it out a little bit. And everything's so precision, it just, that drove me nuts. How did you simulate the drag chain to be similar to that?
So as we discussed before, N15 is expensive. And so what that means is typically we're working with small plots. And so I would just, if anyone out there is looking at N15 research, definitely look at how they simulated the applications. The anhydrous project, that was very challenging because we were trying to do applications with a toolbar of anhydrous on a 7.5 foot long plot. Everyone can understand how difficult it is to get good accuracy and precision with that type of application. That is why we had a whole separate paper that was published to talk about how we were able to accomplish that application. That's totally Tim Smith's doing. He designed the toolbar and was able to get it so that we could trust that we were applying our 200-pound rate. We did go in and do, I'm going to call it soil sampling. We had a Giddings probe that had like a plate sampler on it. I don't know if that makes sense. It was like a slice. So we could take a slice of soil to make sure that we were applying what we thought we were applying in that band. So same way with all the other applications, you had to be a little bit MacGyver about all of our application simulations, because it was important to us that we were, applying it how a producer would apply it. So for the drag chain, we had a undergraduate student. His name was Lucas Goldschmidt. So hi, Lucas. He went back with a hoe and lightly covered the band with soil that was next to the band. So how well does that simulate? You're bumping around with the drag chain. Yeah, that could potentially be an area where maybe we had better incorporation than what you might see with a drag chain. Yeah, so something to keep in mind.
But the takeaway, farmers, is between conceal, which is expensive, okay, and the drag chain off the back and covering it with the drag chain, not much of a difference, in your research. So, if the $1,000 a row for conceal is out of your budget and you want to go off the back, don't let best be the what's the saying? Don't let best get in the way of the good. So definitely consider that. So, you're getting started in your career. You've seen a lot of fascinating things, and I can just, in our short period of time that we've been together, I can think of, dozens of research tracks that you can take. And now with the new emphasis on carbon intensity, right, production, greenhouse gas, most everybody's focused on carbon, but boy, every time you can eliminate nitrous oxide, you've done 283 times more than someone that's eliminating carbon dioxide, right? So what do you see as the realm of possibilities for your future research and career here? This has got to be amazing.
Yeah, so I definitely want to continue the work that I've been doing, looking at efficiency. I think that's always going to be something that I want to look at. But up here in North Dakota, things are a little bit different. They have a lot different cropping rotations, many more crops grown up here extensively than down in Illinois. There's also a lot of soil fertility issues that aren't present down in Illinois that are present up here. A lot more salinity issues. We're starting to have some pretty severe acidification issues in the western part of the state. And then there's the whole shorter growing season, right? So that complicates things as well. And so, I'm going to be still looking at efficiency, but there's some other things that I'm hoping to work on as well. I also would like to kind of get into the realm of soil testing and kind of looking at improving nitrogen recommendations for the state as well. Dave Franzen has done a lot of work up here and has done a great job. And I would like to continue contributing to that as well.
So farmers right now, when this podcast released, they're going to be going back and forth in the combine, or they're going to be, looking at our California farmers, almond harvest and tomato harvest and those kind of things. And what should they be contemplating here as they're trying to hit the grain cart or, watch the loads go from the field? what are some takeaways you think that farmers really need to consider for next year and for the future as they're building their cropping systems and their fertility programs?
Yeah, I think just thinking about efficiency is important. And part of that is maybe not so much even trying to figure out what your efficiency is, but just understanding what you're doing on your farm that may be contributing or hindering you from getting the most out of your resource that you're purchasing, your fertilizer applications. And just be aware that there are ways that you can increase your efficiency. And that was demonstrated by the projects we've done. We saw that, again, as simple as don't broadcast, but ban your starter applications. Things like in-season applications, those can increase efficiency. I know sometimes it's difficult to get out in the field at those times, but you can increase efficiency. And then things like anhydrous ammonia, you don't get super high efficiency with those. So if possible, think about not putting it out there 6 months before the crop is there, those kinds of things. I think it's easy to kind of want to find a kind of silver bullet to efficiency and to find this amazing, easy pill type of solution. But to put it plainly, it's going to happen in small increments as we look at changing our management practices and how we're putting on the nitrogen. It's not going to be a situation more than likely where we find this one product that we're going to put out there and it's going to solve everything. And so just, look at it practice by practice. If you're curious about something, throw some stuff out there for an acre or two and just see what happens.
That's a great thing. That's what I was going to recommend to everyone when you're considering next year. Try, half a field or a quarter of a field. Get some acres to it so you can see what's going on.
Mhm.
Reduce your rate of what you're currently doing. Partner with a neighbor that might have nitrogen on the planter if you don't, and just say, hey, help me out, help me learn. Check the pride at the door and go learn, because we all need to learn. Or if you are putting some nitrogen on at the planter, a very common application is 10 gallons. And I would say, really, if you're putting on fall and you have 10 gallons on the planter, why don't you look at putting 20 gallons on the planter, maybe nothing in the fall, and side dress the rest? Look at all these options that we have. And just because you side dress doesn't mean you have to side dress the whole farm and you're worried about getting the whole farm side dressed. Try a little bit, right, Kelsey? Just go to a little more on the planter and put the rest on side dress and put on 2/3 as much as what you would have done. You don't see what it is. And then if you like it, guess what? They have these monster machines now that cover 24 rows at 10 mile an hour to side dress. If all of a sudden you're getting, 10 to 12 more bushel and you're buying 50 units less nitrogen, that machine gets pretty cheap real quick. So, you wouldn't be afraid to recommend to people, just try something, right? Try anything.
Yeah. And I think, there's power in knowing something works for your land, right? And you can, listen to different ideas and you can read about different things, but until you actually try it for yourself and prove it to yourself that it does work and that it's going to be something that's beneficial to you, whether it's increasing yield or decreasing input costs, then you're not going to know. So yeah, you gotta try.
Exactly. And I think it's too easy to do what we've always done. And we have to be willing to get better over time, right? Because just think about it, folks. Your ancestors did, because if they didn't get better over time, you wouldn't be in a tractor, you'd still be on horses. So we have to be looking at it all the time. Any other things I should have asked about in our time together here, Kelsey, or things you'd like to share about what you see going on not only at North Dakota, but in the industry itself?
No, it seems like we covered quite a lot of ground, and as long as I'm talking about efficiency, I'm happy. That's definitely something that I think is worth everyone's time and consideration with nitrogen management for sure.
Because the efficiency is not only a score for your checkbook, it's also a score for how good you were to the environment, right? Because the better your efficiency, the less leakage you've got built into your farming system. Is that a way to think of it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a good way to think of it, so a really very flamboyant display of nitrogen pollution is in the Gulf of Mexico, right? We have this big hypoxic zone with all these nutrients that have come down from the Mississippi and created this growth. The algal growth depletes the water of oxygen and destroys ecosystems. So it's a really easy thing to kind of point to and say, you know, this is where your fertilizer is going, right? So if you're not fertilizing your corn crop or whatever crop you're applying nitrogen to, you're fertilizing this big body of water in the Gulf of Mexico and destroying ecosystems. And I think, you know, the water pollution is also a pretty hot topic, at least it has been for the past 5 years or so. Des Moines Waterworks, right? That was a big deal when that happened. And certainly that's kind of an example of where pollution did come back to the farmer, and there was accountability that had to be done for that. So yeah, it's a benefit to the taxpayer, but it's a benefit to the producer as well to increase efficiency for sure.
Well, stay in touch, and thank you for all the work that you're doing to help us understand the importance of efficiency and how that can be attained and various practices. Happy to connect you with any of our producers that we have, you know, that are working with us and explore ways and any way we can work together would be great.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, Kelsey, take care.
Bye.
Like to take a moment and follow up on what Dr. Kelsey Griesheim was talking about here. Pretty interesting things and what we need to look at in nitrogen use efficiency. So here's your task list of things to consider, and I hope you will, because if we're not utilizing the nitrogen for our soil in the plant, it is pollution for somebody else, and you should really care about that. You know, Seth Watkins was on our podcast. Several others have been on our podcast, and if you're listening, you want to do a better job. So here's some hints on how you can. So first off, going to talk to the Corn Belt folks. If you're doing fall ammonia, really need to aggressively look at a way to get out of that system. First off, you can start by putting 25% less on in the fall just to see what it does. After that, I would really consider setting up your planter, because you can get nitrogen on the planter. That is huge on efficiency, huge on the ability to be able to integrate cover crops, go to no-till, and improve yield and reduce nitrogen. That is a step, while it's awkward, requires tendering and those kind of things. I do like to say, yes, it slows you down in the spring. And guess what? Yes, it slows you down in the fall. I'll let you figure that one out. So get the 10 gallons on the planter. Let's say you're already there. Okay, next step. What's the next right step? If you're at 10 gallons on the planter, putting on about 30 units of nitrogen, get that planter up to 80 pounds. That's a sweet spot. Get to 80 pounds of nitrogen on at the planter. Make sure we got sulfur with that, ammonium thiosulfate, possibly potassium thiosulfate. I use that, for example, on our farm along with Fast Track with the planter. But get to that point, and that seems to be about an optimum. Then get the side dress, and you want to side dress probably at the Y drop or colder. Get that out there about V5, V7 to apply the balance, or ideally no more than 80 units and do another application if you want to get really fancy. But that's kind of the order. Get away from it in the fall, put some on the planter. If you're doing some on the planter, do more on the planter, and then balance a side dress. Now for irrigation folks, this will be our people that are in our western area, pivot irrigation, or way out west on drip line and such in California. We need to be thinking about irrigation from a part per million standpoint instead of from a pounds per acre standpoint. We need to make sure that we're front loading the system to get the biology in the system awakened and functioning, but then we need to spoon feed it after that. So you'll notice on all our recommendations when we're working with customers, that's how we design the system. And a lot of times, especially in supplemental irrigation, so let's say Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma on pivots, if we have a good year and we get a lot of rain, we kind of can get behind on our nitrogen applications. So we have to catch up a little bit on that first pivot, but we really want to think of nitrogen applied as a part per million of total water received, whether it's through the irrigation pipe or from Mother Nature. And so having systems set up to where we have injection on every pivot that can inject in a microdose all the time, that's where you're going to get superior results and match the uptake curve. You got to front load the uptake curve by about 21 to 28 days so that it can be in the soil and available for the plant for its peak use. A couple other notes on nitrogen as you go to cover crops, whether they are high leguminous cover crops or high carbon cover crops, they typically require more nitrogen. Now, obviously, the high carbon cover crops will require additional nitrogen up front, but this is not more total nitrogen for the whole season. It's simply you have to shift. You have to front load the nitrogen more because, as we were talking on the podcast, microbes eat first. And we want to make sure that you have the nitrogen there to feed the microbes so that the nitrogen is available for your plant later on. So real key points there as you're addressing these things. The other thing is we want to be careful. Excess nitrogen application is also associated with diseases. So bacterial diseases in almonds, tomatoes, diseases in corn. When we have too much nitrogen, especially nitrate nitrogen, that makes that plant more susceptible to disease. So we want to do everything possible to not slug feed. We want to feed as the plant needs it and in a balanced form that the plant needs. A couple other things, we don't promote our products a lot on this podcast, but our biological turbo is great at helping to accelerate that system. She mentioned enzymes in there. That's what it's designed for. Encouraging the soil microbial community through enzymatic activity to release more nitrogen available for the plant. It works great. Typically, we find that that'll improve nitrogen release by about 40 to 50 units per acre, which means you can buy less. So we get better utilization. We lower that denominator, as Dr. Griesheim was saying. There's other things you can do too, as far as just constantly looking for every opportunity. And I just hope as you're listening to this, you're thinking through your nitrogen plans for this next year. Think about every way that you can become more efficient, because not only is it better for your pocketbook, it's better for everybody else that breathes, eats, and drinks. So I really appreciate that. And I hope you enjoyed the podcast today. And if there's any way we can help you and think a little bit differently about nitrogen, how to do it within your system, the equipment that's needed, how to make it happen, reach out to us. We'll connect you with one of our local professionals, or we'll help you directly, whatever it takes. It's our mission to grow crops in a better way that's better for the soil and ultimately better for everybody. So thank you for listening today, and we hope we can help you in some way here in the future. Take care.
Thanks for listening. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about your nitrogen management plans and ways you can explore applications that are beneficial to the environment and your soils. And as always, if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing to help growers implement soil health practices, check out our website at asn.farm. And there you can click on links to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. There's a lot of great things happening and always something to learn. Thanks for listening.